I don't think Revelation offers a comprehensive guide to what it means to follow Jesus or ethical or far from political program. I do think Revelation insists that a key question in Revelation is loyalty. What does it mean to follow the Lamb with absolute loyalty and faithfulness? From John's point of view, that will get you in trouble and might get you killed, not by Roman imperial forces, but by your neighbors. But Revelation does say a little bit about what the way of the Lamb is. The Lamb has been slaughtered. And the Lamb is, Revelation uses this language in many places, the faithful witness, the one who bears witness to the truth, to what is right and good.
Hello. Welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Carey. I'm going to keep the intro quick so we can get right into it. If you're listening for free, please subscribe, rate, all that stuff. Hit me up on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Threads, really any social media platform. The podcast is out there. Follow on YouTube if you like to get clips and things like that. The full video episodes, though, are only available for $5 a month on Patreon. So that would be the ideal set of circumstances, is as many people as possible jumping over there to Patreon. $5 a month gets you episodes right now 10 days early, and then I think starting in 2026 it'll be about 12 days early. So because I want to get right into the conversation, here is my conversation with Carey. Enjoy. Carey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jared. It's an honor to be here.
Well, let's pace ourselves. Reserve that judgment for the end of the conversation.
Fair.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am Associate Dean and Professor of New Testament at the Moravian University School of Theology, which combines Lancaster Seminary, where I've taught for 26 years, and Moravian Seminary. And I'm a New Testament scholar who's done a lot of work on Revelation and apocalyptic literature.
Okay. I want to plug, if you're a listener out there, I did do, and I don't know, Greg, if you've had a chance to listen to it, I did do an interview early on in the podcast with Ben Witherington just about apocalyptic literature, just to kind of, hey, what does this mean? And so hopefully we will get into some of that. But yeah, just as a companion piece for listeners, that episode may be helpful as well. The Moravian thing, I may have to pick your brain when we're done recording, because I'm doing a long, like, every tradition that engages with biblical text. And when I saw Moravian, I was like, okay, I'm going to need to make sure I get that if I don't already have that on my list, because I'm not familiar with the Moravian. I know of it, but I don't know enough about it. So anyway, welcome. Today, speaking of Revelation, we're going to be discussing your book, Rereading Revelation, Theology, Ethics, and Resistance. And I don't know how in 170 pages, not counting back matter, you put so much into a book. But you did it. It's a lot. And I always have trouble, and people who listen to this podcast will know I always have trouble kind of collecting my thoughts. I'll have 3 or 4 things going on at once. But reading your book, I was like, man, it made me think of past interviews that I'd done. I know in the questions that I sent you, I brought up Howard Wass. Maybe that will come up. I don't know. Sorry, I tend to get kind of rambly. So we'll jump into, okay, Revelation as a text. You brought up apocalyptic literature, but how should listeners approach Revelation if they're planning on sitting down to read it? What are any tips for understanding before you go into that book?
There are 2 basic things I would say about Revelation. One is that it's unique within the New Testament, at least as a whole book, in that it's a literary apocalypse. Other ancient Jews and Christians wrote other literary apocalypses. We know what they're like. But when you're in Revelation, you're going to get a lot of visionary language, a lot of symbolism, a lot of contrast, a lot of crisis. All of those things tend to come with the apocalyptic literature. And to recognize that that's really a kind of poetry that ancient Jews and Christians used to communicate some of their convictions and concerns. So just knowing that it's different and being able to read it with that sensibility, it's not the ordinary kind of discursive narrative most Bible readers are used to. The second thing is that Revelation says this clearly, and it is the case, was written to actual communities of Jesus followers, probably late in the first century. It's not meant to be a roadmap for future events, even though a lot of Christians read it that way. In some ways, we could read it like we would read one of the letters of Paul, where he's talking to the Galatians or the Corinthians about stuff that was actually going on. Revelation, like other ancient apocalypses, does that too. So to the degree that we can understand what kind of book it is and bring our imaginations into that ancient setting, that's how we'll be able to find some kind of meaning from it.
To pause for a moment on apocalyptic. So a detail that I found in your book that I don't know I had picked up anywhere. I may have just been not paying attention in the past, but that apocalyptic is, as a genre, I suppose, is kind of an after the fact thing. So that's not to say that there isn't something intentional that authors are doing in the texts that constitute apocalyptic as a genre, but it's not the same thing as, say, an epistle or a bios in the ancient world, where the author knew they were doing this thing. That was an idea that they had in their time. Did I understand that correctly?
I think it's a little fuzzy. So it is true that using the word apocalypse to cluster all these texts together, but not other texts, is something scholars do to try to analyze and make sense out of them. Though the book of Revelation starts by calling itself an apocalypse. The Greek word is apocalypsis, and that's the first word. What I think is the case is that the sort of literary building blocks of apocalyptic discourse were already floating around. And John, the author of Revelation, we don't know much else about him other than he's John, the author of Revelation. John uses those as if he's familiar with them from other works of literature. Revelation's heavily engaged, for example, with the book of Daniel, and the second half of Daniel works very much in the same way, a series of visions, a lot of dramatic symbols, a lot of conflict, and Revelation is deeply drawing from Daniel in its own presentation. So I would say it's not a genre in the sense of if you want to write a haiku, you need to know how many syllables for each line, but it does have literary conventions that are fairly recognizable. I think authors and some audiences would have recognized them. Does that help clear up the muddiness of it a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm. Hopefully, I won't ramble too much. I'm gonna try to walk myself through this. So
Yeah.
the the understanding that from the author, from the point of view of the author, that they are communicating a thing or things that have been revealed to them uh, from the divine or actors on the behalf of the divine, that is a common thread throughout this.
Absolutely. And, part of the messiness is it wasn't just apocalypses, right? Hebrew prophets, Greco-Roman prophets, Egyptian prophets also spoke out of revelations of the divine. It's just that the texts we identify as literary apocalypses have some distinctive features. But I think it's really more helpful to think about the ways these texts interact across those boundaries than it is to say, oh, Revelation's an apocalypse. We know what that is, and it's going to do these 7 things. That's probably a little strong for how the author of Revelation thought he was writing. I mean, he also describes the book as prophecy, and he also describes the book as letters. And so it's not just a narrow kind of construction. You know, I used the example of a haiku earlier. You could use a sonnet where the formula is well known and strictly followed.
So I think combining something we've mentioned and the thing that hasn't come up yet,
Mm-hmm.
so the prophetic or revelatory aspect of it and the authoritative aspect of it are both kind of combined here,
Yeah.
as well as would be the case in any time where you're saying God or the gods revealed this truth to me. You're saying that there's authority to it, but if there's, whether it's direct or subtly made a reference to something that's already authoritative. So in this case, Daniel, or I think it's like something you say something in the book, like 1,000 instances of biblical texts being referenced throughout Revelation. It's like the single highest, right, in the New Testament.
It is the most dense and the largest number of allusions to passages from Hebrew scripture. And the number depends on who's counting, but some count as high as 1,000, some say 250. But the author of Revelation is deeply engaged with the Hebrew scriptures.
Which, and I don't know. I'm worried if I'm going too far and bringing too many things in,
Yeah.
because it's a Jewish text.
It is. I mean, the author of Revelation, if we call him Christian, that's not wrong in the sense that he's writing out of devotion and worship toward Jesus. But he also is writing a text that is profoundly Jewish at a time when there's no such thing as competing world religions called Judaism and Christianity, right? So to say that it's a Christian text doesn't rule out it being fully 100% a Jewish text, too.
So it is apocalyptic, which is to say revelatory, which is to say prophetic, but is also foundationally a Jewish text, which I I think, reading your book again, an idea that I think had just kind of floated around in my head that I was not aware of was the idea that it is superseding. And I'm not sure if you've had much time to listen. I know you're a busy man, but that's like supersessionist ideas and anti-Semitic ideas. They're not really welcome on this podcast, and
No.
when I find them, it just makes me more committed to that, because it's out there, it's everywhere. It's just the air that we breathe within religious and theological
Yeah.
understandings, to just kind of find yourself saying like, yeah, but that was the Old Testament God. Anyway, that I
I
digress.
share that commitment 100%.
Good. Then I'm in good company. Can we go more into that? What does it mean for Revelation to be a Jewish text? Like, should that affect how? I mean, it's almost entirely going to be Christians reading this text. Should that affect how they read it?
They should, a first step would be just to imagine how much of the New Testament is written by people who don't call themselves Christian or use that language. So to imagine a stream of devotion to Jesus that, from the point of view of the authors, is an expression of Judaism. Now, they're going to engage in conflict with most Jewish communities because they think Jesus is the Messiah or Son of God, that he's a singular figure in the history of the world. And Revelation is written from that point of view too. So that's naturally going to be a point of conflict with other Jewish communities of the day. But for the authors, they think of themselves as Jews who follow the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. How does it make a difference in helping us? It would help us to read Revelation and the concerns that Revelation has alongside some other Jewish texts from the period, like Daniel, like some of the books of Enoch that are gathered together as First Enoch or Fourth Ezra. These are also revelatory texts that are very concerned with the political realities of the day, especially foreign invaders, the Greeks or the Romans occupying and dominating Judea. Revelation has that concern just as much as these other Jewish apocalypses do. A sharp concern with behaving in faithful ways in a culture that, expects religious devotion to many deities and many forms of expression that a Jew, or we might say a Christian, would abstain from. Putting those concerns in Revelation and understanding that those are Revelation's concerns is definitely helpful. I don't know how helpful it is to spend a lot of time trying to say, how Jewish is Revelation or how Christian is Revelation? Because I don't think John, the author, is asking that question.
Yeah, that question probably would have been gibberish. Mostly because it was in English, and it's unlikely that he spoke English. Yeah. So, okay, but the challenge, and this comes up in a few places, of Christians will say reading Revelation with their priors, their theological priors. So the main one there is Trinitarian theology, and you don't deny a Trinitarian theology, but you do address the issue of taking fourth century Nicene, very developed articulations of Trinitarian theology and trying to lay them over Revelation. So, if we're not going to do that, what is the approach to say, like, here's a good angle of entry into this text if you know those priors are there in someone's head?
Well, if you're asking specifically about how Revelation deals with the figure of Jesus in relation to divinity, um, it's not wrong to see in Revelation the kind of grappling early Christians were doing about Jesus. He shares the throne that is God's throne in the book. Sometimes there's the one on the throne, and it's clearly not referring to Jesus. And even in some scenes, the Lamb, a symbol for Jesus, is standing in front of the throne. But then in other places, the Lamb is on the throne, and then it's the throne of God and of the Lamb. And so you see this blurring of Jesus' identity with the identity of the God of Israel. And you'll also see on a lesser scale blurring of language about the Spirit or Holy Spirit. So you can see how early Christians reading books like Revelation in the New Testament got to a Trinitarian place. But those concerns are not the primary concerns that John has. John's primary concerns are how these little circles of assemblies of Jesus followers should live faithfully in the moment they find themselves. And that's a set of concerns that, apart from the focus on worshiping Jesus, which is a huge focus in Revelation, the concern of behavior is not necessarily a Christian concern more than it is a Jewish concern in that context.
I think I honestly, I mean, I had an idea because I read your book, but I wasn't entirely sure what you were going to say. But I was assuming your response to that was going to be it's reading it with an understanding of the person of Jesus. The challenge there is, though, in my opinion, so I'll say what seems like a simpler text would be like in Matthew. Jesus comes to the disciples and he says, "Who do the people say that I am?" Right? That whole thing. And in the end, Peter says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God." And the way that I was raised, and the way that I
Right.
think if you just walked into almost any American evangelical church and you were like, hey, what's being said here? They would be like, yeah, the Trinity, right?
Sure.
I that to me feels very much like, and I know this, my mom is going to be listening and she'll be like, yeah, we had this problem with you too. So I'll just call it out. Problem that I had in math, problem my son had in math, problem many children have in math, which is like, why do you want me to show my work? And it's important in math because, like, well, if you don't do it correctly, eventually you won't get the right answer.
Mm.
I think here the issue is more getting the right answer. Sure, okay, I guess you've done theology well from a systematic point of view, but how much faithfulness to the text and to the appreciation of the context should one bring when one is reading these texts? And if something as simple as this interaction, which I wouldn't say is easy, but it is simple in Matthew, was at 16, and then coming over to Revelation and trying to understand how do I see the person of Jesus? Because now you have the lion and the lamb, which I always
Yes.
thought, oh, he's just the lion and the lamb. And again, I didn't notice until I read your book. You're like, nope, the lion disappears. So I know I just rambled. So if you have any thoughts on what I just said, I would like to hear you kind of unravel your thoughts on what happened to the lion.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Yeah. And that might get at this whole Messiah question too. So in chapter 4 of Revelation, John hears a voice that invites him up to the heavenly throne room where God sits with these other heavenly beings. And for the rest of the book, it appears he's watching things from that heavenly perspective. In chapter 5, he sees that the one on the throne, God, is holding a scroll, and it's sealed with 7 seals. And he hears who is worthy to open the scroll and open its seals. Now, we don't know at that point. What we'll find out from reading Revelation is when the scroll is unrolled, so is the fate of the world. So it's really who has authority over human destiny. And he hears that no one in heaven, on earth, or under the earth is worthy or qualified to open the scroll. And then he hears, oh, wait, the Lion of Judah is worthy. He can open the scroll and its seals. So he's been very distressed, crying big tears, he says, and now he hears a lion is going to open the scroll. So early Christians used a passage from Isaiah 11 that talks about, or 5, I'm forgetting the chapter, talks about the Lion of Judah, and they appropriated it as messianic language. Okay. And the lion conveys this sense of a deliverer who is forceful, ferocious, right? It's the kind of image that one might hope for from a Messiah, because the fundamental thing, a Messiah or Christ, same concept, one word is Aramaic, one is Greek. The concept is, this is a person who, in the end of days, will redeem Israel and fix the world. So, lion. And John looks and he doesn't see a lion at all. There's no lion ever from this point on. The primary image Revelation will use for Jesus starts right here. He is a lamb, and he's a lamb who stands having been slaughtered. He has, many eyes. He has all this knowledge, but whatever he does as a Messiah is not lion-like, it's lamb-like. So in other places, he's described as having a sword and being drenched in blood, but the sword comes from his mouth. It's his words. It's the truth is the way this lamb conducts its combat, and the way the lamb's followers will participate too. They don't take up arms. They keep telling and doing the truth. So commentators will disagree on this point. Some commentators argue, well, Revelation introduces the lion, but kind of shades it with the image of the lamb. And so Jesus is both lion and lamb in Revelation. My own view is, well, if that was what John wanted to convey, he's a very skilled writer, we would hear from the lion again. But we never do. And so you really, in this moment, you have poetry working as theology, right? The poetry is the symbols of the lion and the lamb. And the theology is, what kind of Messiah are we following, and what kind of power does it exercise? And I would argue you get a very different picture from a lion than you do from a slaughtered lamb. I think that's the work that's happening. And it's the fundamental work that early Christians had to do when they tried to communicate that Jesus was the Messiah. If he's the Messiah, why are the Romans still here, right? Why has Jerusalem been devastated by Roman armies and depopulated? Why isn't Israel in its own land, running its own business, living in peace and righteousness and prosperity? If Jesus was the Messiah, why didn't he do those things? And the image of the Lamb, a little long-winded response to a good question, the image of the Lamb is one way in which one early Christian is interpreting what it means to call Jesus Messiah.
Is the violence as depicted, and the lamb does kind of complicate that.
Yeah.
The violent depictions, parody's not the right word, because parody's on the other side, right? Like the Evangelion of the Roman Empire
Yeah.
is in other places in the New Testament depicted as the parody of the actual good news. So is that violence here depicted, is it supposed to be figurative, or is this an aspiration? I mean, yeah, sorry, I question kind of broke down going from a thinker to a talker.
Revelation's just filled with human suffering, violence, environmental degradation, and interpreters really struggle in and debate how to make sense of it. So, most Christian readers, when they read Revelation, read it this way, that God and the Lamb violently destroy and eternally condemn or punish God's enemies. And I understand why. There are other notes in Revelation that if you choose, and I'm admitting, being transparent, this is a choice I make of trying to read Revelation hopefully. It's not what everyone thinks. It's what some people think. You can emphasize other dimensions of Revelation. One would be Jesus as a lamb whose sword is literally what Revelation says, his testimony, the truth. And his followers conquer by imitating the lamb and sharing their own testimony. So the violence that occurs, some readers would argue, is what happens when you have an exploitative empire and it collapses. It creates a lot of violence, but even its own destruction generates a lot of violence. Now, you can't redeem all of Revelation. I need to be transparent about this from the start. I can name lots of problems I have with Revelation, and one is that when it talks about the Lamb's enemies, it celebrates their violent destruction and encourages readers to want its violent destruction, and uses some misogynistic language to do it too in chapters 17 and 18. But you can read Revelation as more inclusive and as nonviolent if you emphasize some parts of the vision over some of the others. And as far as I know, any reader dealing with this question is choosing how to balance the different parts of Revelation together.
I should have looked it up. Just for your benefit and the listeners' benefit, many of the questions that, I mean, I do send a page of questions to the guests, but many of the things that I end up bringing up on the podcast pop into my head as I'm kind
Yeah.
of thinking about what I read within the 2 hours before the conversation begins. And one of those was this of like, Jesus describes coming judgment in the Gospels, destruction of Jerusalem, things like that. And a thing that popped in my head is like, what is the substantive difference between depictions of judgment in Revelation and depictions of judgment like that? And it sounds like there are parts of Revelation that just go farther. That there's a little bit of enjoyment on the
Right.
part of John or the martyrs, maybe even, you know, there's participation. It's less of just like, hey, this is about to happen, and more of like, yes, so break out your foam fingers. Is that, I won't speak for you on that. I'm curious. Did I get that right in my little shower thought thing?
I think you're talking about emphasis and imagery, and I would agree that Revelation foregrounds, celebrates all of that, the violence and degradation of against the Lamb's enemies. Um, it's like they're not human. It'll say, you know, even though they're being tormented, they won't repent. They continue to like resist and curse God. They are enemies of the saints and dangerous to them, the saints being the followers of the Lamb. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this kind of destruction is really destruction that's just happening in the world. And it's going to bring about the coming of the Son of Man, which is another phrase that's very adjacent to Messiah. And the Son of Man's going to come and fix it. It doesn't say the Son of Man's going to smite and slash or any of that. It's the way of the world that you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. It's going to get bad, and the Son of Man will come and intervene. In Revelation, you have a scene where the martyrs, those who have been slaughtered, Revelation says, for their testimony, the martyrs are in heaven crying out for vengeance. How long before you avenge us, our blood on these oppressors? And when something really gruesome happens, very often at that moment, you'll hear a chorus of heavenly voices saying something like, great and true are you, O God, and your judgments. That's not a direct quote, but these hymns celebrate God's righteousness right at the moment when a modern reader might be saying, oh, this is a little much. So there is definitely, for me, a different feel in how Revelation addresses these issues.
I think so. You use Viktor Orban as an example in the book, and yeah, that's appropriate. I think to a certain extent, Vladimir Putin could probably also be thought of in this way, but an authoritarian who, in many instances, is seen as identifying with, you know, the I guess plight of contemporary Christians, and this kind of gleeful acceptance of violence and oppression being a counterbalance. But I was also kind of thinking as I was reading, like, I could see how Christendom would definitely be like, yeah, this is this is the book
Yeah.
for us, bringing Christianity or Jesus following into an imperial system, something like Revelation, where if you don't want to see the nuance, you don't have to see the nuance. It makes a lot more sense than, I would say, the Gospels. So, is that like, is there any more to it in your opinion for how someone could say, "Oh yeah, blessed are the peacemakers," but also we're going to very joyfully go after the people we see as our persecutors?
You know, one thing I've learned is this is a little bit of a sideways response, but one thing I've learned is even pacifists can enjoy the suffering of their enemies. And I don't know that that's a good thing, but it's the case. Where I land on the question of Revelation's vision of violent destruction And I'd love to be really clear about where I land because I don't like it as a modern Western person. But one of the most compelling books I've ever seen written about Revelation was written by Alan Bozak, a black South African anti-apartheid activist back in the 80s, imprisoned and tortured. And he's seeing Revelation in that context. How is God going to deliver justice to a situation this violent and repressive? And he has a line, this is a near quote from the book. He says, if Christ's cloak is splattered in blood, like it is in Revelation, it's the blood of his enemies and the oppressors of his children. In other words, this system we're living under is so violent that it deserves destruction. And if that destruction is also violent, so be it. And when I read that, and you can tell I've been holding on to it for a very long time. I read that in the mid-90s, and it's still the one thing I can quote from scholarship about Revelation. I don't like a desire for vengeance. I think it's dangerous. It has a long history of playing out in Christian behavior that has been destructive and sometimes suicidal, but otherwise murderous. I don't like it. And yet, if Alan Bozak is sitting in the room, he's still living, if he's sitting in the room and I just couldn't challenge what he says. I haven't been imprisoned and tortured under an apartheid regime. And I think that experience would shape my ethics. So what I will say is the author of Revelation believes that the Roman Empire and his larger culture, he's writing in a part of the Roman Empire called Asia, which is basically Western Turkey to us. He finds that imperial culture completely idolatrous, completely exploitative, and completely violent. And his point of view is followers of Jesus cannot compromise at all with a society like that. Literal language in chapter 18 is get out. So his point of view is that this is the kind of crisis that can brook no compromise, and whatever happens to them, they deserve.
Not to break, that was a very powerful thought, but in there you said something that I was like, oh, I need to double back to this because I'm worried I'll forget.
Yes.
Okay, it's 7 letters within this one. Is this like an email with 7 names in the to line and everybody else is in the CC line? Because like there is obviously a very special message for each of these churches.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also what seems to be a universal message. Am I misunderstanding that?
The way I would talk about it is, and let's just be clear, we don't know everything. We weren't there. The whole thing could be fictional in the address to these 7 churches. But most scholars, and I'm among them, think these 7 letters actually are trying to describe what's going on in some early Christian assemblies in Roman Asia. And the way I would put it is, it was written for them, but we overhear it, right? What it means to read an ancient text is to enter its world and participate. So, if we were reading Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, we wouldn't say that it was written for us, but we might ask, before we would go off on an adventurous war, oh, are there any analogies here that we might draw from? I think for contemporary readers of Revelation, it's extremely important to understand how John is assessing his cultural moment. It is the crisis that defines history. And before we start appropriating it and saying, yeah, that's how the world is, I think we need to do some discernment, right? You mentioned John's authority. I mean, John presents this vision as if any Christian who disagrees with him, any follower of Jesus who disagrees with him, is facing divine judgment. This comes up in those letters to the churches, right? Am I so sure of my opinion about this issue or that issue that someone who disagrees with me necessarily is committed to evil and consigned to destruction? Well, that's pretty rare. And at the same time, haven't there been times when human communities, and sometimes specifically Christian communities, have had to draw a line and say, we can't compromise with this thing? How do we discern what that is? Whether it was Charles Finney in the 19th century saying, we can't cooperate with Christians who own and enslave other people, or Bozak in apartheid South Africa, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other resistors against the Nazis, advocates of the civil rights movement. At some point, these figures decided this is right according to our understanding of what it means to follow Jesus, among other things. And there is a profound wrong that has to be condemned categorically. And to me, what Revelation calls a modern reader to do is acknowledge that those moments are possible and then discern how we engage things in our world that, Revelation uses the image of the beast or the monster. What are the things in our world that are beastly that we should have no part in and resist?
I think someone who wasn't specifically in that list, but is very kind of in keeping with the imagery of Revelation would be John Brown, who had that
Yes.
very same intent.
Yes.
I mean, just looking at a picture of the guy, like if it hadn't been slavery, it was going to be something with him. But and I would say that made his legacy very complicated, but also very simple. There is no, I know there's a thing on Reddit that I'll see from time to time. I don't argue with people that John Brown would have shot. But
you also don't shoot people John Brown would have shot.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, I don't. That's fair. It does feel tempting, which is the part. It was tough for me to read the line of, but if Jesus' blood is covered, or Jesus' robe is covered in blood, it's because it doesn't comport with, I think, either the narrative or theological understandings that I have of Jesus. And I kind of had this whole thing. Look, since I talked to Curtis Freeman 2 years ago, he put this bug in my brain of like, incarnational theology does not really permeate a lot of evangelical theology. And a lot of the places that I've looked around, I see it. I see that, like, wait, hold on. I don't really know much about the Beatitudes at all. That's not something we spent a lot of time talking about in churches where I grew up. In fact, many of the gospel stories outside of crucifixion, this crucicentric understanding of who Jesus was, has really tried to just say, like, oh, everything before that is a cold open. And we don't pay attention. And even the resurrection gets short shrift in relation to, if you look at Catholic theology or Orthodox theology, or a lot of other, Protestant or somewhat Protestant traditions, they try to talk about, oh, no, the incarnation is very important. The fact that Jesus came and became a man. And so trying to gear my thoughts toward that, and understanding of, well, if Jesus is covered in blood, it's his own. That's his whole bag, right? But I could totally see if what the world you live in is a place that is just like, it's fertile for the culling or whatever of the perpetrators of evil. Yeah, that might be the case, and it is from a point of view of privilege that I would critique that.
And I think that's the essential thing, Jared, is acknowledging our own accountability and agency as readers. You know, these texts do not tell us what to think in some way that's obvious. And if anyone questions that, all they have to do is look at the range of Christian opinions, right? It's not just given, but it's also a matter of making sense in our own moment. Um, so I can sympathize strongly with those readers of Revelation who say this is a call for nonviolent resistance against oppression. That's how I want to read it too, and you read my book, you see me bending in that way. But I can't explain all the problems in Revelation away, the misogynistic language, the celebration of the violence and judgment that occurs. All of that is, it's what it is. The other thing I would say is, even within Revelation, you see that not all the Jesus followers are diagnosing their situation the same way John is. In chapters 2 and 3, he names these apparently competing prophets who are within the churches. They're not outside the churches. And they apparently have audiences. He calls them Balaam, the Nicolaitans, Jezebel. These are all fictitious and, at least in 2 of the 3 cases, slanderous names. But what he's acknowledging is they interpret the moment differently. And why does he give them so much energy if there aren't other Jesus followers who disagree with John and see it the way these other prophets do?
So the nicknameification of your opponents, like we don't know who these people are, and there's no indication that we could even assign. If we had some other text that talked about another group in Asia Minor, we couldn't even figure out who they are, right?
Correct, 100%.
Okay, but that's a pretty standard thing. Again, kind of going back to the authoritarian of just like painting with a broad brush. These people, I've consigned them to Satan. I'm done with them all. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with that.
Well, and I think, and in the book I try to make this case. Almost every interpreter of Revelation basically agrees with this. I mean, scholarly interpreter. What's at stake is how an ordinary person in a city like Ephesus or Pergamum is going to relate to the social, religious, and economic order around them. And there's a brilliant, fairly recent book by a scholar named Anna, I think it's Bowden or Bowden, who teaches at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, where she puts it this way: imagine that you're a stonemason in Ephesus. What is John asking you to do? Well, if you're a stonemason, that means you're a member of the stonemasons guild. The guild is going to have a patron god or goddess or set. It's going to have rituals and probably sing hymns. But the stonemasons guild is also how you get your business. It's also maybe how you pay for your burial through your membership and dues. It's what gives you social security as a stonemason. And if what John is asking is for you to abstain from everything that has anything to do with gods other than the God of Israel and God's Messiah Jesus, then wait, you're going to have to quit being a stonemason? I mean, most people in the ancient world were right on the edge of survival. So what John seems to be asking is for people to commit economic and social suicide based on his assessment of how evil Rome and its culture are. And when you put it that way, it's really easy to imagine how other Christian prophets would say, look, it's okay to do those things. They don't really matter. don't, it's fine, accommodate. But John is having none of it. And that seems to have been a live argument, at least in some of these assemblies in Roman Asia.
I think it may be, and please correct me if you don't think that this analogy scans. That's fine. So I know that I was born in 1983, and I know that really even a little bit past that time, there was a pretty strong ecumenical um, movement, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
in this country, or cohesion even
Mm-hmm.
in this country. And sometime as I was coming of age, the backlash to that politically in the United States really started to kick in,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and has been going on for the last 30 years, and I feel like that's what we're seeing now. And I'll hear people say, over the last 15 years or so, what if we just had a consensus? But like, well, we had a consensus. We had a political consensus. There was a cultural consensus. And I don't really read history as like things were moving in the right direction, because that's what they do. I
Right.
don't have that understanding of
Right.
history. But there does seem to be like, oh, there is a peaceful norm
Mm.
established, and then an attempt at a radical overthrow of that. And what has been happening in the United States for 30, 40, 50 years is probably a more peaceful, lower stakes version of what you're saying was happening for early Jesus followers. Does that scan?
That's an interesting analogy. I think about those dynamics all the time. Um, there has been ever since the fundamentalist modernist controversy, there has been conflict among more traditionalist and more socially progressive and moderate churches. That conflict has been a part of our religious scene. But there's no question the level of division and the alignment of those particular theological lifestyle outlooks with political power and the polarization of political power is a defining moment that is contributing to our democracy wobbling really badly right now. So I would say that the developments you're describing aren't new, but the intensification has been so rapid. So I graduated from high school in 1983. Um, and, I knew Christians
But
who
young,
thought,
right? But you
yeah,
graduated young.
yeah, other Christians who didn't believe the way I did. Were they really saved or really not? I'm a former Southern Baptist. We worried about that. But you also could all get together and pray. We had civic religion, that tended to transcend denominational kinds of boundaries. And now we have Christians using the language of conducting warfare against other Christians in our culture. So they are claiming basically a point of view like John's. There's no compromise with these people. We can't even. They have to be subdued. I I think you asked a provocative question.
I don't know if this is going to come across as comforting or just like more doom. I've been listening to a biography of William F. Buckley by a man named Sam Tannenhouse, and pretty early in his time starting the National Review, or actually even right before he started the
Mm-hmm.
National Review, a lot of that combat language was in a speech that he gave probably in the early 1950s
Mm.
after he left Yale. And the more I follow things like that, the more I'm like, oh, this just sounds like McCarthy. He sounds like a pretty familiar guy. That, like, yeah, we still have Roy Cones out in the world. Uh, so we're coming up close on an hour.
Sure.
I don't want to monopolize too much of your time, but we have not addressed eschatology, and I did want it. So, okay, what is an example of a text that you would point people to biblically and say this is, very little controversy is around the idea that this is an eschatological text, and then we'll get to why I'm asking that in a second.
Sure. In 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul writes about what the resurrection of the dead might look like. That's presumably a future event, and he doesn't lay out just some clear scenario, but he's writing about it.
So yeah, I'm glad you gave those as examples. Those are the ones that, like, growing up a dispensationalist, dispensational premillennialist, you read Revelation and you're like, I mean, I can maybe kind of piece together some of the stuff that I'm being taught and how it overlaps with this, but then you get to 1 Corinthians 15 and it's like, yep, that's it. And then honestly, I got older and I read like some exegetical approach, like readings of it, and I was like, oh, that's not that at all. But that so it's not to say there's no eschatology within Revelation, but that it is not in the same way that 1 Corinthians 15 is just that. Is that what you're saying in the book?
Well, Revelation's, I don't know how we assess primary concern. I used that language earlier in this conversation, is how to live in its own present. But what makes that make sense for John is that in the end, the Lamb is going to conquer, and the Lamb's followers will face a blessed future. And Revelation describes, a second resurrection and a new Jerusalem and all those things. I would emphasize that Revelation, in doing this stuff, is also drawing from a bunch of Hebrew scripture and is using the language of poetry. So the mistake that we've often made is to try to create a timeline or a set of definitive doctrines about one thing or the other based on a text that isn't trying to do that. And the background you described, where we read these things this way, I used to call it a jigsaw puzzle approach. We assumed we could take a passage from Zechariah and a passage from Daniel and a passage from Matthew and 1 Thessalonians and Revelation, and that God had designed them so that if we put them together the right way, we would have a systematic understanding of how the future will unfold. Rather than letting each of those books be themselves and have their own concerns and acknowledge when we're dealing with poetry rather than, sort of ordinary discursive, this and then this and then this. So Revelation does have an eschatology. It's pretty direct. The Lamb will conquer and make everything right, and the saints will live in glory. And maybe everybody else is destroyed or tortured or included. There's room for all of that in how we read Revelation. But it is fundamentally about God's will prevailing in the end.
Ultimately, so if you're looking for Khrushchev or Saddam Hussein or Peter Thiel, you're not going to find any of those individuals depicted in Revelation. Okay, in the questions I sent you, I put this thing about Stanley Hauerwas.
Yes.
And I know that you said, I don't know that I could. Okay. I like to send questions, but what I wanted to do there, and for listeners, go back, listen to that episode, the conversation with Stanley Hauerwas on Watership Down. But he says in that essay, Christians in America have too readily accepted liberalism as a social strategy appropriate to the Christian story. What I wanted to say was that idea has, even before getting your book, it's been rolling around in my brain a lot, honestly, in the 20 years or more since I read it. Because, so whether you're saying, oh, well, in the liberal, and I don't mean like, left leaning, I mean like Western liberalism, and I'll explain more of that in the conclusion, listeners, in case you're wondering, but that fitting within, a kind of civic religion in America, that I think would be maybe what he was thinking of when he wrote that back in the 80s. That is not necessarily the call for Christians, whether you're looking at Revelation or any other biblical text or just the call to follow Jesus, that it does not exist within that system, nor is it exist within a Christian nationalist system. So that's kind of where my mind was, because that does come up a bit in the book. And so if we're talking about resistance, what is the, in a nutshell, in Revelation, like, here's the affirmative vision that you are called to? And I know you've referenced it or alluded to it, but like, how do you characterize that as we're kind of closing things down here?
I don't think Revelation offers a comprehensive guide to what it means to follow Jesus or ethical or far from political program. I do think Revelation insists that, a key question in Revelation is loyalty. What does it mean to follow the Lamb with absolute loyalty and faithfulness? From John's point of view, that will get you in trouble and might get you killed. Not by Roman imperial forces, but by your neighbors. But Revelation does say a little bit about what the way of the Lamb is. The Lamb has been slaughtered. And the Lamb is, Revelation uses this language in many places, the faithful witness, the one who bears witness to the truth, to what is right and good. That's not a full package for a lifestyle by any means. It requires, I use this word all the time, it requires discernment. What is that truth exactly? But you mentioned, I might return to earlier in our conversation, there are those moments when human beings, and speaking as a Christian, Christians are called to discern when they need to align in a very particular way for or against a value that they see as essential. And, I wouldn't agree with John Brown that you should necessarily kill everybody who's aligned against you, but he did identify a good issue. Slavery was an abomination. Imagine, I grew up in Alabama, imagine a Southern Baptist pastor in the 60s welcoming black visitors into their white church, or even saying it should happen, because we know what the consequences for some of them were. I don't know of any of them being killed, but being beaten up, fired, threatened was very common. Revelation speaks to those moments where we discern that there is only one faithful path. And that's a dangerous moment of discernment because it doesn't allow for much compromise. It can lead to devaluing the humanity of people who differ from us. That would be fair to say of John Brown. But those moments do come, and Revelation's the only book in the New Testament that reminds us of that reality by putting it right in front of our face.
I think maybe simply put, someone else's judgment may not necessarily be your business.
Yeah.
Is there anything from the book that you were hoping I would ask about, and there's plenty, that I did not?
I wanted to talk about those communities and the stonemasons. So I got that in. There are other things that I could talk about, but the essential things were about why Revelation is relevant and the kinds of assumptions we need to bring to it. And you kind of led with that, Jared. So I'm grateful.
Well, I'm grateful that you were here at all. What would you recommend, other than this book, which I highly recommend, pick this book up? What would you recommend for listeners to get a better understanding of Revelation or apocalyptic literature or any of the different subjects that got brought up here today?
One of the great things about Revelation is some wonderful scholars have written. My book is written at a level that assumes a certain familiarity with scholarship. It's not written just for scholars, but I would recommend Robin Whitaker's little book on Revelation. as, you know, it's a 120-page guide that covers a lot of the territory that we've just talked about. Other books like that by David Da Silva and Michael Gorman have been helpful. I could name other authors, but have been helpful to a lot of readers. On apocalypticism, recently, a Harvard scholar, Annette Yoshiko Reed, has been on Substack writing about how we make too much out of defining apocalyptic as a category and how that keeps us from seeing relationships between, say, a book like Revelation and a book that might look very different from a literary perspective. But by she's sort of deconstructing the category of apocalyptic as a helpful boundary for reading. Annette Yoshiko Reed on Substack, I would point some folks toward.
Yeah, I know she's on Twitter. I think I follow her on Instagram. Yeah, she's out there. I got the name of this podcast from Bruce Metzger's book, Breaking the Code. Is that one that you would recommend? I know I would, but you don't have to if that's not one you would recommend.
That's the classic book in that genre. It's just that it's old and will have some opinions that I think Metzger would emphasize. He thinks that there was active persecution of Christians when Revelation was written. It looks like things were probably more subtle. So it's a little dated, but no, it's a classic of exactly that kind of clear, accessible way of getting into Revelation. Brian Blunt, Can I Get a Witness? Um, is, and I hope I've got the title right, he wrote a book on Mark that's sort of similar, but a short guide to Revelation that draws upon African American cultural resources.
Okay, I'll have all of those in the show notes linked. Now, what do you read for fun?
Oh man. So I hate to admit it, I haven't been reading for fun a lot lately because I've been reading a lot of political science um, with the things that are going on in our world. Um, I do love short stories. I love essays. And so I'm nibbling slowly on a collection of James Baldwin's writing. One of the benefits of that is it reveals my own history to me. He's writing from about the time I was born. And one is, if you want to learn how to write, read James Baldwin.
Do you know the name of the collection?
It's in it's a series of great American authors.
Okay.
And so I think the title is just Baldwin.
Okay. I'll try to figure out how to link that. Any other short story authors?
I'm a big Flannery O'Connor fan. You can tell I
Oh.
go back
Oh.
more than.
What in particular?
Oh, I've assigned to students, have you read A Good Man Is Hard to Find?
I've read everything I could get my hands on when I was like 20, 21 years old.
That is just grim.
Wise Blood, The Violent Bear It Away. Yeah.
That is grim. And also, there's a collection of her young adult prayers that she composed while she was in grad school in the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, where she's just bearing her soul as a pious young Catholic.
There's a thing about there's her and John Kennedy Toole that there's this thing of like darkness in southern writing. I don't know if you've read the Neon Bible.
I have not. Sounds like I need to.
So have you read Confederacy of Dunces?
No.
Okay, read Confederacy of Dunces and then read Neon Bible. But there's this weird depiction of darkness in the South where you know that it's not actually that dark, like like it's a bright place, but there's this darkness. Oddly, a Yankee who I think gets that right is Nathaniel Hawthorne. He writes a very similar darkness. But yeah, no, I really like her. I haven't read her in a long time. But I was getting into her and Kurt Vonnegut and a lot of other short story folks in my early 20s.
Demon Copperhead by Barbara King Salver.
I've not read anything Yeah, I've not read
also
anything by
gets
her.
at there's this mix of humanity and hope and just grim desperation that she manages to communicate.
Well, this is all going in the show notes. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Thank you so much, Jared. This has been a pleasure.
Greg Carey, thank you. Take care. Okay, we did it. We're at the end of the episode. A few thoughts as I'm closing things out here for this episode before we get to what next week's episode is. I mentioned in the conversation with Greg Carey here liberalism, and I reference it in conjunction with bringing up Stanley Hauerwas. So, just for context, well, one, go read that essay by Stanley Hauerwas on Watership Down, and then go read Watership Down, and then go listen to my conversation with him. But liberalism is an important topic, and at this point, I've recorded an episode that won't be out until January, so I'm sorry, but with Brian Walsh and Sylvia Kiesmont, and the topic of liberalism comes up. So it seems, at least from my point of view, Hauerwas' concern was that Christians would supplant their responsibility to the gospel with a devotion to liberalism, seeing liberalism as a solution where they should see their engagement or service within the gospel. So just so that we're clear, because in American politics, liberalism tends to refer to the center left of the American political spectrum. So I Googled it just to give you a sense. Liberalism is a political philosophy and worldview centered on individual liberty and equality, which advocates for individual rights like freedom of speech and religion, limited government intervention, and a market economy. So I think if you're an American listening to this, that is just the consensus of life, liberalism, and what people like Hauerwas um, and other Christian theologians and biblical scholars are addressing, is that there is a call to a specific moral and ethical responsibility within a gospel, whether it's a narrative or ethical framework. And I just wanted to call that out because it does get confusing. And there's a whole history of why liberal tends to mean center left, I think, going back to FDR. I won't belabor that point here, but because I did bring it up and I didn't want to take a lot of time in the conversation explaining that. That is what liberalism is. I'm not saying that it's bad. I don't think that Hauerwas is saying that it's bad. I don't think anybody is necessarily saying that it's bad, but that it is one in a number of competing approaches to the world, and what Hauerwas and others, and when you get to my Brian Walsh and Sylvia Kiesmat interview, you'll see they are also of a mindset that Christian communities need to engage in a way unique in service of the gospel narrative. So that said, next week on the podcast, I will be talking to Jennifer Houston McNeil about her book Under Her Wings. This is one of those books where I got an email from Erdman's, and then, hey, would you like to read this? And I went and looked it up, and the subject matter, I said yes, based on the subject matter. It's about motherhood. But then I went and looked at the cover, and I was really glad that I said yes, because I think you can judge books by their covers. I think the design of a book cover tells you a lot about the energy put into the book. And so I hope you enjoy this quick preview of my conversation. If you are listening for free, you can hear this episode now for $5 a month on Patreon. Just go on over there, throw it on your $5 a month, and you'll hear this episode right away, as opposed to waiting until next week. But if you'd rather wait, that's fine. That's up to you. Just, do all the things, the follow, rate, subscribe, engage on social media. And then, yeah, I'd love to see you throw in $5 a month. So if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Goodbye.
I mean, I think another reason that we didn't touch on earlier is the difference between the way mothers and fathers were viewed in the ancient world. So the father figure is this figure of authority, right? He's invested with authority, not just in the family, but by the power of the state. The patriarchal system invests him with the authority he has in the family. And that isn't exactly the kind of authority that Paul had in his communities, right? He wasn't sort of their king. He wasn't ruling over them. He was having to persuade them. And I talk a lot about the influence of mothers in the book. And I do think that mothers had a lot of influence over their children in the ancient world, but it wasn't the legally binding type of authority or influence that they had, right, of the father. It was more just through the relationship that they had with their children and the influence that is naturally a part of the mother-child relationship. And so maybe that's another reason that Paul chooses to use this maternal language, even though he's a man, because that's actually closer to the relationship that he had with these early Christian communities, right? He didn't have any legal authority over them to make them behave the way he hoped they would or think the things he hoped they would think. But he was trying to persuade them, right? He was trying to influence them through the relationship he had with them. And so I think in that sense of influence that a mother has, I think is a key to many of these images in the New Testament.
I think it's interesting to see a father as the giver of life, because that's not predominant, at least from my point of view, that's not predominantly how we see it now. That it's not, oh, the father gives life and the mother just, I don't know, bears it. As far as how people come into the world, it seems like our understanding, again, in 21st century America, is more along the lines of mothers give life. And even the idea of mother's milk is giving life. I don't know, maybe that's why so many men feel so lonely and sad, because they, which, whatever.
Well, I mean, I think, we're chuckling when you say that, but I think in a way there's a little bit of that going on in these ancient texts where men choose to employ maternal language. It is this sort of like this amazing thing that happens, right? That new human beings come out of women. And this is like sort of one of the amazing miracles of life, right? And so, men do look at that from the outside. And discover that it's quite a rich image to draw on, right, for theological reflection. And so, in some ways, they seek metaphorically at times to take on that role that they see women taking.